These negotiations did not stop any further tragedies. Depending on perspective, it actually led to more tragedies. When the negotiations started, yes, a part of the Japanese military go back to Japan to reorganize. However, the rest that was stationed in Korea, during the 3-year negotiation period, they could freely crisscross the lands, and they took the lives of and enslaved a lot of civilians. Korean generals asked for the ceasefire agreement, the negotiations, to be called off so that they can go and fight and stop them. However, at the top of the chain of command were Chinese commanders, even over the Korean king. Of course, because China was military-wise stronger. So these negotiations were between China and Japan. So the reason why China did not let Korea call off the negotiations, well, there were in large 2 reasons. Number 1, the atrocities that were being committed on civilians, they weren't atrocities being committed on their civilians. And second, these negotiations were suggesting deals that were not too bad from China's perspective either, such as dividing Korea into 3. Korea keeps a third, China takes a third, and Japan takes a third. This deal was not too bad of a deal for China either. So, the negotiations keep going for 3 years, until China also feels like Japan has finally crossed the line. They demanded that the Chinese emperor sends his child to Japan as a semi-hostage and a symbol of submission. This damaged China's pride, and therefore the negotiations were called off. The negotiations fell apart. So now the 2 factions were back at an all-out war. So because now they were back at an all-out war, the military units that went back to Japan were back on their way to Korea. Now the timing of their mobilization was leaked. So the Korean king orders Admiral Lee Sun-shin to go meet them in the middle of the sea to fight them here so that they cannot land like they did last time. However, Lee Sun-shin was very hesitant, and while Lee Sun-shin was being hesitant, they do land. They land safely. Admiral Lee Sun-shin thought that this was a trap. Lee Sun-shin thought that information on the timing of their mobilization was too easily leaked, so that they can lure Lee Sun-shin's fleet into a battle that takes place in the middle of the sea. Why would fighting in the middle of the sea be a trap from Korea's perspective? Well, that's because the difference in how battleships were built between Korea and Japan. Korea's battleships were designed to be bigger and more sturdy. On the other hand, Japanese battleships were designed to be smaller, however faster and more agile. So, fighting them in the middle of the sea, where they can freely showcase and sport their speed and agility, was not a good idea. That's why Admiral Lee Sun-shin always fought the Japanese fleet close to shore, where there are a lot of islands and rocks, so that these islands and rocks will limit the mobility of the Japanese battleships so that they cannot freely sport their speed and agility. So, this was a win-win situation for Japan. If they can lure Lee Sun-shin into a fight that takes place in the middle of the sea, well, good. If they cannot lure Lee Sun-shin into a battle that takes place in the middle of the sea, well, that's good too, because they can freely land. As a result, yes, Lee Sun-shin did not stop them in the middle of the sea, and they do land. Now, when this happens, Lee Sun-shin was called in by the king for interrogation and torture. If we just look at it from the surface level, technically speaking, some could say the king did not technically do something wrong, because yes, under war, there has to be a systematic military law that has to be strictly, rigidly abided by. And according to military law, mutiny, insubordinance, not following orders, yes, is a capital offense that can be punished by execution. However, there are a lot of people who interpret that there could have been some more personal reasons. Because at the time, the king completely lost the support from the people for his cowardice and incompetence during the war. On the other hand, Admiral Lee Sun-shin became a hero to all. Literally speaking, all the civilians who lost their homes were gathering here where Admiral Lee Sun-shin was, because everybody was telling everybody that the only safe part in Korea is where Admiral Lee Sun-shin is protecting. So, based on circumstances, one can interpret and deduce that the king could have been afraid of Admiral Lee Sun-shin, declaring himself king, or maybe even siding with Japan to dethrone him. Whether there were personal reasons or not, well, either way, Lee Sun-shin was called in and was interrogated and was tortured. Now let's zoom out from the war and zoom in into Lee Sun-shin's personal life a little bit. When Lee Sun-shin was called in for interrogation, his mother, in a place called Asan, Lee Sun-shin's hometown, she felt that this might be her last chance to see her son. So she tries to travel to her son. However, at the time she was very old and sick. She was in no physical condition to go on such a trip. But she does, and on her way, she passes away. It is recorded that Lee Sun-shin cried for days when he heard the news. And also, Japan sends assassins to, once again, Asan, Lee Sun-shin's home. There, they met Lee Sun-shin's young son. Lee Sun-shin's son who was waiting for his grandmother and father to come back home. The young son picks up a sword and tries to fight, however he never sees his father again. Now, Lee Sun-shin was not executed, however he was convicted of mutiny and he was dismissed from the military. So when he came back home, he of course could not see his mother and had to see his dead son. Now let's zoom out from Lee Sun-shin's personal life and then zoom in and not forget that the two factions were back at an all-out war. So because Lee Sun-shin was dismissed from his position, the commander of the Korean Navy, the king appointed a new commander. His name was Won-gyun. Now, Won-gyun leads roughly 170 battleships to the Sea of Busan to attack Japan. However, that day, most of them were destroyed, sunk, and were buried in the Sea of Busan, and they are still there to this day. Only 13 damaged battleships return. When this happened, the king once again appoints Admiral Lee Sun-shin to the commander of the Korean Navy once again. And at the time of the appointment, the letters that were written between the two, the king and Admiral Lee Sun-shin, is still to this day very well known. The king writes a letter to Lee Sun-shin saying, "I have no words to express how embarrassed I am for my impudence. I have no words to express how ashamed I am, and please forgive me that I have to once again ask you to fight for the people." The orders were given. He was appointed once again. However, the appointment was not the only order given. There was another order added in one of the other letters. It also said, "However, I heard that there are only 13 damaged battleships left. It seems like the Navy is irreparably damaged to the point where it is no longer operable on its own. So take your soldiers and join the army on land." That was another order that was given. At the time, the letter that Admiral Lee Sun-shin writes back to the king still resonates with all of us. The letter that Admiral Lee Sun-shin wrote said, "Your Highness, I still have 13 ships left." Securing defending waterways was essential. Admiral Lee Sun-shin understood this. And more than anyone, Japan understood this. Because if they can freely cross the Southern Sea and go to the West Sea, it means that now there is nothing stopping them from directly attacking the main cities of Korea and also the king. So Japan, once again, mobilizes its fleet. Yes, their one and only fear, Admiral Lee Sun-shin, was back in command. However, they thought that Lee Sun-shin must be heavily compromised because of the after effects of all the torturing he went through, and also the fact that he only had 13 damaged battleships left, because most of them were destroyed and buried in the Sea of Busan while he was gone. Japan's assessment was accurate. However, Admiral Lee Sun-shin lures them into a place called Myeongnyang, where the waterway is narrow and the water swirls because there are so many rocks underwater. Because the waterway was narrow, numbers meant less. And because the water swirled too much, because of all the rocks underwater, they could not skillfully maneuver their battleships that were known for their speed and agility. So therefore, it was a battle between 13 Korean battleships and 133 Japanese battleships. However, that day, 31 Japanese battleships were completely destroyed, 70 of them were damaged, and the Japanese fleet had to retreat. This was called the Battle of Myeongnyang. So this gave time for the alliance on land to push back, and once again started a period of exhausting back and forths between the two factions without any kind of tangible or meaningful gain. But then the Japanese king dies and the war was called off. So now the Japanese units one by one were plotting a safe retreat back to Japan. Were all Koreans now satisfied? Well, not all of them. Some generals argued that we have to chase them down, because if we let them go back like this, they will dare try this again. So they argued we have to chase them down, completely destroy their fleet, so they cannot dare think of waging war again. But once again, at the top of the chain of command were Chinese commanders. So at the time, the Japanese commanders bribed Chinese commanders and asked them to stop the Korean military from pursuing them when they are on their retreat. So, Korean generals could not pursue the retreating Japanese military. At the time, Admiral Lee Sun-shin was not immune from this either. At that point, there was a Chinese commander with Admiral Lee Sun-shin. However, not just a commander, the supreme commander of the entire Chinese Navy, named Jilin. It is interpreted based on multiple sources from multiple parties from multiple angles that there was a genuine respect between Jilin and Lee Sun-shin, soldier to soldier. However, respect was respect, and self-interest was self-interest. They were completely two different things. So at the time, Supreme Commander Jilin was also bribed by a Japanese commander who was in a place called Suncheon. This commander was also plotting a safe retreat back home to Japan. So this commander bribed Jilin and asked him to restrain Lee Sun-shin, stop him from pursuing them, chasing them down when they are on their retreat back home. However, Jilin at the time was very passive in restraining Admiral Lee Sun-shin, because although he took the bribes, at the same time he had a great level of respect for Admiral Lee Sun-shin. So because Jilin was very passive in restraining Lee Sun-shin, he still managed to block the retreat route. Of course, the Japanese commander was furious at the time, sending letters to Jilin asking him, "Why aren't you honoring our deal?" However, Jilin did not give a concrete, clear-cut answer. Jilin was being very passive. Now it seemed like this Japanese commander in Suncheon was in danger. However, this Japanese commander was a very important political figure in Japan. He was the right hand to the king that just passed away. So the other Japanese commanders come to rescue this Japanese commander in Suncheon from Isun-shin. At this point, now things have gone too far. So even for Jilin, who took the bribes, now it was too hard for him to just look away and pretend that nothing was happening. So Jilin enters the battle as well. So now breaks out, arguably, the biggest naval battle in this whole war. A naval battle that took place in a place called the Sea of Noryang. So therefore, it is called the Battle of Noryang. It is estimated that there were roughly 500 Japanese battleships that were directly engaging in battle. 450 of them were destroyed or captured. Only 50 went back. Admiral Isun-shin's goal was to not send even a single battleship back home to Japan. Then how did 50 get away? Because in this battle, Admiral Isun-shin was shot on his left chest, and he never returns to his people who were waiting for him to praise and thank his heroisms. When Jilin, after the battle, heard the news that Isun-shin was dead, it is recorded by Jilin's soldiers themselves that Jilin bursted into tears. The depictions, the records regarding Admiral Isun-shin is very consistent from multiple sources, multiple angles, and multiple parties, whether it's from the enemies or from friends. The depictions of Isun-shin altogether consistently suggest that he was respected as a soldier from everyone, including Supreme Commander Jilin. It is recorded by Jilin's soldiers themselves that Jilin always ordered his soldiers to not have him or his soldiers walk ahead of Admiral Isun-shin, to always make sure that they walk alongside him or behind him, and refer to him using honorific titles. After the war ends, he doesn't go back to China immediately. He stops by at Asan. You remember where Asan is? Isun-shin's hometown, and he meets Isun-shin's remaining family members and tells them, "I will make sure to talk to the king, so that the king will look after all of you with great honor and respect for the rest of your lives." And when he goes back to China, he tells stories about Isun-shin, and in the future, Jilin's grandson actually immigrates to Korea, saying that, "My grandfather always talked about Korea as the lands of his good friend, Isun-shin."